So welcome back to a comparison review of the Starboard Pocket Rocket and the Starboard Hyper Nut. Two surf shapes from Starboard, exactly the same constructions, and you can get them in very similar volumes. But which board is best for you? And also, what conditions will those boards best perform in? We do get these questions quite commonly about these two boards, and especially now because Starboard have revamped their Pocket Rocket in 2020. So in this video we're going to be looking at the shapes of the boards, how they perform on the water, what sort of conditions they perform best in, and really finishing off with making sure that you're buying the best board choice for you and your SUP surfing. So a little bit of background first about the Pocket Rocket and the Hyper Nut. The Pocket Rocket has been around a lot longer than the Hyper Nut has. The Pocket Rocket is really up there with one of the most established boards in the Starboard range, and they've been making it for years and years and years. Yes, this is the newest shape. They refined the rails, the tail and the bottom shape, which we'll speak about in a minute, but it's a very established board in their range. The Hyper Nut is still an established board, but it's definitely not as old as the grandfather of SUPs here, the Pocket Rocket. It's a newer breed of board that's come around in the last sort of 5 years. And definitely a lot of you are interested in the Hyper Nut because of its super short and compactness and the fact it goes in your car super easy. But that isn't really why you should be looking at the Hyper Nut, especially over the Pocket Rocket. The Hyper Nut comes in a large range of sizes, from a 7-foot board right up to 145 litre. The Pocket Rocket is only available in the one size. It sits in Starboard's wide ride range of boards. This is an 8.3 by 30 inches and it comes in at 135 litres. But there's a Hyper Nut that sits almost exactly at the same characteristics. They do a 710 by 31.5 and it comes in at 130 litres. So looking at the specifications, a lot of people are going to be able to paddle both these boards, but these boards are completely different on the water, and that all starts with the overall shape. If we look at the two boards side by side, you can see they are very different shapes. You can clearly see that the Hyper Nut is a much squarer, compact shape, and the Pocket Rocket is a much more rounded shape. The tail of the board is much more pulled in towards the tail, and the nose has a much more rounded nose section. The Hyper Nut fits that square box, really square at the nose and still relatively square at the tail. The rails, the outside shape of the Hyper Nut, are very parallel. They're very straight up and down. The Pocket Rocket is that more pulled in, rounded shape. That really affects how the board feels on the water, which we'll speak about in a minute. But if we look at the bottoms of these boards as well, turning them over, they come in different fin setups. The Hyper Nut comes as standard just as a quad setup, which is 4 fins. 2 front side fins are bigger than the 2 smaller back fins, and the Pocket Rocket is finished off with a 2+1. You have 2 side fins and you have a larger central US box. You can run the Pocket Rocket as a quad setup as well, but it comes standard as this 2+1 setup. So talking about the boards a little bit more on their own now, looking at the Pocket Rocket first. So as I said, this is the new Pocket Rocket from 2020. They refined the rocker line, they refined the rails at the back, and you'll see underneath they've refined some channels which are very similar to the more performance Pro Shape boards. This board's got a lot of volume and a lot of thickness up at the front, so it gives you a good stable platform, but the thickness up here is a lot thicker than the Hyper Nut. Gives it that sort of more floaty feel, which is great for that more beginner intermediate paddler. Because both these boards are finished off in the Starlight construction, which we think is definitely one of the standout constructions from Starboard, incredibly tough, incredibly high wearing on the rails, and the boards really don't weigh very much at all. The boards still come with the same sort of features, so you still get the same recessed carry handle that's nicely built into the EVA deck pad, and you've got a nice tail kick pad with a raised foot support so you can feel where your foot is on the pad. So these boards do look very similar. If we look at the bottom of the Pocket Rocket, you'll notice straight away that the rocker line, which is the curve of the board from front to back, is greater than on a board like the Hyper Nut. We'll speak about the Hyper Nut's rocker line in a minute, but the rocker line on the Pocket Rocket is a lot more curved up towards the nose, which is great for punching out over waves, and it really helps when you're wave riding in general, giving you that little bit more performance because this board is a little bit longer. Generally throughout the whole of the Pocket Rocket you've got a concave, which is a recess going down the middle of the board, and basically what that does, it sort of holds the water in the middle of the board. It gives you a very stable feel when you're just standing up and paddling on the board normally, and it pushes the water down towards the fins and into the channeled areas, which are definitely new for 2020. This sort of channel design at the back here has been taken from the Starboard Pro boards, and it really helps with grip on the bottom turn, drive down down the face and help generating speed because it forces the water through the back of the board and out past the back of the fins. And there you can see this board is finished off with the 2+1 fin setup, which is where the side fins are smaller than the bigger back center fin. So now if we bring the Hyper Nut down and look at this, the first thing you noticed is you've got a large area, a big flat area compared to the Pocket Rocket. They're both flat decked boards, but because you've got that extra 1.5 inches, it does give you a wider standing area. But the board is a lot shorter. Having a shorter board helps you pivot and push the board harder and tighter in the turns because it reduces the swing weight and the actual amount of board you have to push through that turn. Another thing you might be able to pick up on the camera here is also the thickness of the Hyper Nut. The Hyper Nut is a lot thinner in general compared to the Pocket Rocket. The Pocket Rocket is 4.4 inches thick and the equivalent 130 litre Hyper Nut is only 4 inches thick, so they've dropped that thickness quite a bit. That gives you a bit more rail shape. It means you can have a tighter, sharper rail, which helps with the drive of the board. But it's just another thing to bear in mind that you might have the same volume in both boards, but when you're standing on the Hyper Nut, you are going to have more water wrapping over those rails because you are not as thick or high out of the water. So looking at the bottom of the Hyper Nut, and especially looking at the rocker line, remember which is a curve from front to back, you'll see how flat the Hyper Nut is really compared to the Pocket Rocket. It's got a little bit of nose kick right at the tip there, which helps you punching out and getting out of the waves, and maybe in those critical sections keeping that nose out a little bit. But really, because the board is so much shorter, you can keep the board much flatter, which helps with the speed. The actual bottom shape of the board is fairly similar to the Pocket Rocket. You've still got your concave up at the nose here, which is holding the water, and subtles down a little bit, but still there in the middle of the board. And at the back of the board, you've still got a sort of depressioned, recessed channel pipe, which works in a similar way to the one on the Pocket Rocket, except it's a little bit deeper and it probably will generate a bit more speed and drive towards the back of the board. And there at the back you can see the quad setup, the two front bigger side fins compared to the two smaller back fins. Starboard this year have got some really nice small back fins, 3.7 inch back fins, and they are really beautiful balsa core bioresin fins. So that's a little overview of the shapes of the boards, but really what do they surf like on the water and why are they so different? Well, if we first look at the Hyper Nut, being a super square parallel outline, even with this parabolic rail that they have almost where it comes in on the board, it gives you have a very straight outline to the rail. So when you're driving down the wave and just surfing in general, you have a much faster, livelier feel with this board. It feels much more reactive and much more skitty or skatey even. The Pocket Rocket, because it has a more of a general pulled in outline, a more rounded shape, as I said earlier, has a more of a traditional feel to the board. Doesn't feel so skitty, doesn't feel so lively, feels a bit more planted. Then because of the tail section of the Hyper Nut and the actual compact nature of all of the Hyper Nut ranges, it means the board's very lively off the turn. It's very loose and quick to redirect and change direction. The Pocket Rocket has a much more slender, flowing feel to the turns. They're not so quicky and reactive, but they are more drawn out, they keep more speed and flow, and they are much more carvy. When we surf these boards back to back, it's really quite obvious how different they are. The Hyper Nut, you almost can't really lean into the turn, you can't really carve the turn that you can do on a Pocket Rocket. You have to be a little bit more upright, a little bit more over the fins, and that is because it's a shorter, compact board. You need to be driving off the tail a little bit more. The Pocket Rocket, you can use a bit more of the full rail. So the Hyper Nut is a looser, livelier, faster board, and the Pocket Rocket is a smoother, more comfortable, carvy base board. So in what conditions will you get the most out of both of these boards? Well, the Hyper Nut has actually got a more of a limited window of conditions. Because of its speed, because it's really fast and generating loose and lively turns, it doesn't actually need very big waves to surf. And if you are surfing waves that are overhead, if not a little bit bigger, and especially if you're on the bigger Hyper Nuts, you will find this a little bit lively and a bit loose, and it will take you a lot more concentration to get the most out of the board. The Pocket Rocket is a board that's happy in the bigger surf. It can handle itself a lot more. It's got that more continuous rail shape, a little bit better rocker line, and the fin setup lends itself to handling those smoother, faster waves. But if you're looking to ride smaller waist to shoulder high, choppy, weaker surf, the Hyper Nut really excels in those conditions. It's great at generating speed, getting as much out of the wave as possible, and it helps you turn the board as quick as possible when the wave really doesn't give you anything back. The Pocket Rocket can work in those conditions as well, but it's not as extreme, it's not as dynamic, it's a lot slower and more fluid. Now the big question, who should be buying what board? Let's have a look at the Pocket Rocket. The Pocket Rocket is an easier board to paddle, catch waves and surf on than the Hyper Nut. It's less skitty and it's more planted under your feet. Ability wise, it's going to take a wide range of paddlers. You could step on this the first time SUP, maybe if you're up to sort of 65, 70 kg, and it's going to really sit a lot of people stepping down from their 11-foot SUPs where they've caught a few waves onto a shorter base board, up to about 85 kilograms. Definitely if you're 100 kg, you could also look at this as a more advanced floatier board. If you've got that surfing background, maybe you've come from longboard surfing, this sort of board is going to be a board you're going to enjoy if you're that heavier weighter rider too. It's really going to help you progress in your SUP surfing, learn to keep flow with your cutbacks, learn to get more aggressive with your top turns, and start to do off the tops and re-entries. So the Hyper Nut is the livelier, faster, funkier, more pivotal board. It's going to lend itself way more to the more intermediate advanced SUP surfers. Definitely weighing, you've got a big weight range and you've got a lot of Hyper Nuts to look at. Maybe the 130 litre one, the 710, could take up to 100 kilo person for sure. It's a bit harder to catch the waves because it's shorter. It's a bit slower to paddle, so your fitness is going to have to be up there a little bit more compared to somebody who's getting into SUP surfing and they're riding the Pocket Rocket. You're definitely going to have to be a bit more on it with your footwork, understand how to use your foot across the back of the board to get the most out of it. Because it's got a smaller window of conditions and you need smaller waves or maybe weaker waves to surf it and get the most out of it, this is what I would call a multi-quiver board. You're going to need a couple boards to sort of really go alongside a Hyper Nut. The Pocket Rocket, happy on its own, but this board, maybe you're looking at a wide point as well, or maybe you've even got a smaller pro board to go alongside it. The Hyper Nut sits nicely with a few other boards, and that really is the biggest difference I find between a Pocket Rocket and a Hyper Nut. A standalone board compared to a multi-quiver board. We're really glad to see the Pocket Rocket revamped for 2020. It's going to get a lot of people catching a lot of waves this year. The Hyper Nut still there, still holding its ground, and still has a very good place in the starboard range. It really is a board to have in your quiver. I really hope you found that video interesting and informative. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please subscribe and like this video if you liked it. Check out SUPboardermag.com, of course, and if you're mad keen on SUP, check out SUPboarder Pro. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.